There is a stage in life that no one announces clearly. It comes without a manual, without a rite of passage, and rarely does anyone look you in the eye and tell you what is really about to happen. That stage falls between the ages of 65 and 75. And according to psychologists, gerontologists, and philosophers who have studied the human life cycle in depth, it is the most demanding decade of all of adult life. Not the most tragic, not the darkest, but the one that concentrates the most simultaneous transformations, the most losses, the most unanswered questions, and more quiet pressure than any other. When you are 30 and life gets complicated, you have time. You have room to make mistakes, to course correct, to try again. But between 65 and 75, the body changes the rules. Identity is shaken. The world starts to look at you differently, and all of it happens at once without anyone having had the honesty to warn you. Today, we are going to talk about all of that. No euphemisms, no empty speeches about the best years of your life. We are going to honestly name the 6 reasons why this stage is so difficult, because there is a truth the Stoics knew well. You cannot walk through something with dignity if you have not had the courage to look it in the face. And when we have named everything, there will be a 7th part, one that brings no more questions but concrete answers, real tools, forged in Stoic wisdom, so that this stage is not merely something to be endured, but something to be lived with an inner peace that very few people ever manage to find. Stay until the end, because what is coming may profoundly change the way you look at the years ahead. Let us begin. The first reason why this stage is the most difficult has to do with something no one in the world can ignore: the body. And I am not talking about aging as an abstract idea, but about something very concrete, very everyday, that begins to happen between the ages of 65 and 75 in a way that is different from everything that came before. Up until 60, the body ages, yes, but it does so in a way that still negotiates with you. You get a little more tired, you take a little longer to recover, but there is a sense of continuity. The body you had at 55 still recognizes you, still responds to your signals with a certain familiarity. But something shifts in this decade. The body stops negotiating and starts setting its own terms. Suddenly, there are pains that had no name, and now they do. There are diagnoses that were once hypothetical and are now written on a piece of paper. There are mornings when getting out of bed takes an effort you never imagined would be necessary. It is not that the body fails all at once. It is something more subtle and, in a way, more unsettling. It starts speaking to you in a language you still have not quite learned to read. And what makes this part so difficult is not just the physical pain. It is the surprise. It is the feeling that the body you inhabited for decades, the one that ran, that worked, that held children in its arms, that survived sleepless nights and early morning struggles, no longer responds the way you expected. And that generates something that goes far beyond the physical. It generates grief, a quiet, intimate grief that very few people dare to name out loud. Marcus Aurelius, who governed an empire while his body fought its own internal battles, wrote something in his Meditations that resonates powerfully here. The body is nothing more than a river in constant change. What the Stoic emperor understood with that image is that the body is not a static possession we must keep intact, but a current that flows, that changes shape, that is never exactly the same from one year to the next. And resisting that flow does not stop it. It only drains you. But there is something else at play in this stage that makes it especially demanding. It is not just that the body changes, but that those changes begin to redefine what you can do, how you move through the world, what kind of independence you have. And for someone who spent decades being self-sufficient, that redefinition can feel like a defeat, like a betrayal. Think of someone who for 40 years was the person everyone turned to when something heavy needed to be carried, when someone had to be on their feet from dawn, when someone had to endure what others could not. That self-image, that identity built around physical strength, begins to waver. Not because that person has failed, but because the body is completing its natural cycle. But the difference between understanding it that way and experiencing it as a defeat changes everything. Epictetus, who lived in a sick body with physical limitations for much of his life, said it as directly as possible. Some things are up to us, others are not. The body is not up to us. And this distinction, as simple as it sounds, is in reality one of the most liberating things you can take in during this stage. Because if the body is not entirely within your control, then resisting its changes is not courage. It is an unnecessary drain on the energy that you can direct elsewhere. The real challenge is not stopping what is happening in the body. The real challenge is learning its new language without losing the conversation. It is listening to what it asks for without interpreting that as a verdict. It is finding, within the new limitations, a different way, not a lesser one, of inhabiting this body that has been your most faithful companion throughout your entire life. And that is precisely what Stoic wisdom proposes. Not to fight against nature, but to know it so deeply that you can move within it with grace. Your body is not your enemy in this stage. It is a teacher speaking a new language, and learning that language with patience and without fear is the first act of self-love this decade asks of you. But the body is not the only thing that changes in these years. There is something equally powerful, equally quiet, that also arrives without warning. And that is what we are going to talk about now. If the first reason strikes from within, from the body, this second one arrives from the outside, or rather, from the absence of what used to be outside. Because between the ages of 65 and 75, many people discover something no one prepared them for. That loneliness can settle into your life without you having done anything to invite it, and without you knowing exactly when it arrived. I am not talking about chosen solitude, the kind Seneca celebrated as the space where the soul finds itself. I am talking about a different kind of loneliness, the kind that appears when lifelong friends begin to leave, one by one, each farewell carrying its own weight. The kind you feel when your children, now adults, have built their own world, and the distance is no longer just geographical. The kind that surfaces when you look at the table, where there used to be noise, and now there is silence, and you did not choose that silence. This is one of the most frequently cited reasons in studies on well-being in early old age, and also one of the least discussed in everyday life. The World Health Organization has noted that social isolation in older adults carries health risks comparable to those of smoking. That is not a metaphor. It is a real measurement of something everyone senses, but few state so plainly. Loneliness at this stage makes people sick. And what makes it especially hard during these years is not just the absence of company, but what that absence represents. Because each person who leaves, each relationship that fades, each social space that closes, does not just leave a void. It also leaves behind a question you sometimes do not dare to ask out loud. Who am I when there is no one left to define me from the outside? I think of the story of a woman named Margaret. She was 68 when her last child moved to another city, just a year after her closest friend died suddenly. Margaret was not a weak person. She had been through divorces, illnesses, financial crises, but she told me that none of those trials had left her with that particular feeling that came afterward, a feeling she described this way: "It is like the world kept turning, and I stood still, not knowing how to start moving again." What Margaret was going through was not weakness. It was the cumulative impact of simultaneous losses that society does not know how to name. Because when someone loses their job, everyone understands it as a crisis. When someone goes through a divorce, there is a language for that pain. But when a 68-year-old woman loses a 40-year friendship and her active role as a mother in the same period, the world keeps looking on as though it were natural, as though it was simply part of the package of getting older, and there is nothing to be done about it. The Stoics had a different view of human connection. Marcus Aurelius, who as emperor was surrounded by people and yet deeply alone in his role, wrote, "What harms the hive harms the bee." The Stoic idea that we are interdependent beings, that our well-being is connected to that of our community, carries particular weight in this stage, because loneliness is not just a personal problem. It is also a signal that something in the social fabric around you has broken and needs to be rebuilt in a different way. And there lies the crucial point: rebuilt, not restored, because trying to recover exactly what existed before is a losing battle. The friends who have gone will not return. The family roles you once held will not come back in the same form. But that does not mean the fabric cannot be woven again. It means it will have a different texture, with new threads, with new connections you have not yet discovered. Loneliness between 65 and 75 is hard, yes, but it can also be the breaking point that forces you to ask yourself, perhaps for the first time with that kind of intensity, what kind of connection you truly need. Not the kind you had out of habit for decades, the kind you want to build now from who you are today. That takes a particular kind of courage. And it also requires understanding the next reason why this stage is so demanding. Because outer loneliness does not come alone. It brings with it something that shakes you just as deeply from within. Throughout your adult life, you knew who you were, not in a philosophical or abstract sense, but in the most concrete and everyday way possible. You were your profession. You were your role in the family. You were the person who held a certain responsibility, who carried out a certain function, who occupied a certain place in other people's lives. And even though no one explained it to you in those terms, all of that construction of roles and functions gradually shaped something you experienced as your identity, as the answer to the question, who are you? But between 65 and 75, those answers begin to disappear, one by one. Work ends, whether through retirement or circumstances you did not choose. Your children no longer need you in the same way. Your partner, if still present, is also going through their own changes. And suddenly, you find yourself standing in front of a mirror without the labels that spent decades telling you who you were, and what you see can leave you profoundly disoriented. This is one of the most suppressed crises of early old age, precisely because society lacks a clear language to name it. There are therapies for grief, support networks for illness, programs for financial retirement planning, but almost no one talks about the identity crisis that comes when the roles that defined you for 40 years simply cease to exist. And yet it is one of the most universal and most painful experiences of this stage. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who devoted much of his work to studying the second half of life, called this process late individuation. Not as a failure, but as a radical opportunity. He said that we spend the first half of life building a functional identity, a self that allows us to operate in the world. But the second half, if lived with awareness, invites us to go deeper than that construction, to find out who we are beneath the roles, to discover whether there is something in us that existed before all those labels and will continue to exist once the labels are gone. Consider this image. Imagine a tree that for decades has grown against a wooden structure someone built around it to give it shape. That structure was useful, even necessary. But over time, the tree grew so much that the structure no longer contains it, no longer defines it. And when that structure is removed, the tree is exposed, visible in a new way, without the external scaffolding. And at that moment, the tree has two options: experience that stripping away as an irreparable loss, or discover that it has a shape of its own, developed over all those years, one that no external structure can give or take away. You are that tree. And this stage is the moment the scaffolding comes down. The question this part of life puts to you is not a small one. It is, in fact, one of the largest questions a human being can face. Who am I when I am not being useful to anyone? What remains when everything I used to do is stripped away? Is there something in me that is worth something, independent of what I produce or what function I serve? Epictetus, who spent part of his life as a slave and the rest as a teacher, understood that true identity cannot be built on external things, precisely because external things can always be taken away. He said that the only thing no one can take from you is your way of responding to what happens to you, your inner judgment, your ability to choose how you position yourself in the face of each circumstance. That, and only that, is yours, absolutely. What this stage offers you, even if it hurts, is the opportunity to find that part of yourself, the one that does not depend on a title, on a role, on anyone's approval, the one that existed before all the labels and will exist after them. But to find it, you first have to sit with the discomfort of being without the familiar costumes, and that requires a tolerance for uncertainty that is not easy, but that can be cultivated. The identity crisis in this stage is not a sign that something went wrong. It is a sign that something new has arrived, something deeper and more authentic than everything that came before. But there is a fourth reason that complicates all of this even further, and it is something that creeps in quietly, something no one admits out loud, but that many people carry every single day of this decade without quite knowing what to call it. There is a particular kind of fear that lives in this stage of life, and it has one feature that makes it especially hard to manage. It cannot always be pinpointed. It is not the fear of something concrete and immediate, like fear of a surgery or a specific piece of bad news. It is something more diffuse, more persistent, more intimate. It is the awareness that what lies ahead may be more demanding than what has already passed, and that you may not have the same control you once had. Between 65 and 75, that fear can take many forms: fear of becoming seriously ill and becoming a burden to the people you love, fear of losing your mental clarity, of the mind starting to slip in ways you will not even be able to detect yourself, fear of dependence, of needing others to do for you what you always did on your own, fear that death is no longer an abstract and distant possibility, but something that feels more present, more tangible, with every loss that accumulates. And there is one fear that may be the hardest of all, because it is the one that gets named the least: the fear of being a bother, of being a burden to your children, your friends, your doctor, the system. That quiet fear that leads many people to downplay their pain, to say they are fine when they are not, to avoid asking for help even when they desperately need it. Because asking for help in this stage feels for many like admitting defeat. What makes this stretch of years concentrate so much existential anxiety is not that the fears are irrational. It is that many of them are completely grounded. The possibility of illness is real. The possibility of losing independence is real. Death is real, present in a way that can no longer be ignored. And fear in the face of what is genuinely possible is far harder to manage than fear of the imaginary. Seneca confronted this with a clarity that is still hard to surpass. He wrote that much of human suffering comes not from what happens, but from imagining what might happen. We suffer more in imagination than in reality, he said. And he added something especially relevant here, that the man who has learned to contemplate death without horror has also learned to live without fear. Not because death does not exist, but because once you stop running from that reality, it loses the power it once held over every single one of your days. But integrating that is not simple. It requires an inner work that many people have never done, precisely because for decades they were too busy with everyday life to stop and sit with these questions. And now, in this stage, the questions arrive on their own, uninvited, in the middle of the night or in the quiet moments that did not used to exist. There is something that modern psychology calls anticipatory anxiety, and in this stage, it reaches one of its most complex expressions. It is not just worry. It is a constant monitoring of the body, of your own abilities, of how others are reacting. A permanent scanning for signals that something might be changing, that something is being lost, that time is speeding up. And the irony is that this constant vigilance, this fear of what might come, ends up stealing exactly what is most valuable in the present. Because when you live looking at the future with dread, today becomes invisible. And today, as it happens, is the only thing that is truly real. Marcus Aurelius, who as emperor had objective reasons to be afraid, who faced wars, plagues, betrayals, and the deaths of several of his children, wrote this: "Do not suffer over what has not yet arrived. If it comes, you will face it with the same resources you used to face everything else." There is a deep confidence in that line. Not that things will necessarily turn out well, but that the capacity to face whatever comes is already inside you. That you do not need to mentally rehearse every possible scenario of suffering. That when something happens, you will have within you what you need to get through it. The fear of what lies ahead in this stage is real and deserves to be taken seriously. But it can also be the starting point for a deeper kind of work that very few people do. Learning to live with uncertainty without letting it run your life. Letting go of negotiations with the future and beginning to invest in the present. That does not happen overnight, but it begins the moment you decide to name it out loud, as we are doing right now. Because what has no name holds power. What gets named can begin to be worked with. And there is a fifth reason that makes this decade the most demanding of all. One that in many ways is the heaviest to carry, because it does not arrive just once, but repeats itself. And each time it arrives, it brings the echo of every time before. There is a phenomenon that specialists in thanatology and the psychology of aging have studied carefully, and it has a name that few people know, but that many live through with full intensity at this stage: cumulative grief. It is what happens when losses arrive in such quick succession that the process of working through one has not finished before the next one is already arriving. And in this stretch of years, between 65 and 75, that phenomenon reaches its peak. Friends go, siblings go, parents go, if they were still alive. Figures who were part of the landscape of your life for as long as you can remember. And sometimes, within the same period, versions of yourself go too. the version that could do certain things, the version that held a certain place in the family, the version that recognized itself in the mirror without surprise. What makes this accumulation especially difficult is not just the number of losses, but the pace. Because grief needs time, it needs space, it needs you to allow yourself to feel it without rushing to resolve it. But when losses follow one another too quickly, the emotional system cannot process one before the next arrives. And so a kind of numbness sets in, a protective mechanism that keeps you from feeling with the necessary depth, that keeps you functioning, but with a background sadness that has no precise name and no single cause to point to. I came across the story of a man named Robert, who was 71, when in less than 18 months, he lost his older brother, his childhood friend, and his brother-in-law, who was also one of his closest people. Robert kept functioning. He kept going to the market, kept to his routines, kept answering when people asked how he was doing. But his daughter told me that something in him had changed in a way that was hard to put into words. He did not cry, he did not complain, but there was something dim about his eyes, as if part of him had left with each of them, and he had not had time to notice how much of himself he had lost along the way. That is what unprocessed, cumulative grief does. It does not destroy you visibly. It quietly dims you. The Stoics acknowledge the pain of loss without trying to erase it. Marcus Aurelius, who lost several children during his lifetime, did not write about loss as something to be suppressed, but as something to be looked at honestly. He said that nature gives and nature takes, and that resisting that cycle does not change it, but understanding it, integrating it, means something very different from simply accepting defeat. It means finding a way to honor what is gone without letting that honoring paralyze you in the present. In the grief that is well-traveled is not the kind that ends fastest. It is the kind that is lived with the depth it deserves. And that requires, first of all, recognizing that what you are feeling is real, that it has a name, that it is legitimate. It is not being sentimental. It is not living in the past. It is the natural process a human being goes through when they lose something or someone who was part of their world. There is a line from the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh that sheds light on this process in a way the Stoics would also have recognized. The deepest understanding is that of impermanence, not as a philosophical sadness, but as a truth that when genuinely integrated, changes the way you relate to everything you have while you still have it. Because grief does not only speak about what is gone, it also speaks, if you know how to listen, about how much you valued what was there. In this stage, learning to move through grief without rushing it and without ignoring it is one of the most important skills you can develop. It is not something you learn from a book or a philosophical phrase. You learn it by being present with the pain when it comes, by allowing it without dramatizing it, by seeking support when the weight becomes too heavy to carry alone. And there is something that can help in that process, which we will explore in the 7th part. Because not everything in this stage is loss. There is also a strength that is built precisely through what has been endured. But before we get there, there is one more reason why these years are the most difficult of all. And this last one comes from a place you may not have expected. There is something that happens in this stage that is uncomfortable to name, but would be dishonest to ignore. The world, society, the everyday environment begins to treat you differently, and that difference does not always arrive as direct aggression or obvious discrimination. It arrives in small gestures, in phrases that seem innocent, in subtle attitudes that taken in isolation might seem insignificant. but that accumulated day after day build something that hits with real force. People speak to you more slowly, as if you had lost the ability to understand. They ask questions in your presence directly to someone younger, as if your answer would somehow be less valid. They grow impatient when you take a moment at the checkout, and there is a line behind you. They assume your limitations before you have demonstrated them. You are taken for granted in certain conversations and excluded from others without explanation. Gerontologists call this ageism, a form of discrimination so normalized that often even those who practice it are unaware they are doing so. And what makes it especially damaging in this stage is not just the immediate impact of each individual gesture, but the cumulative effect on a person's self-image. Because when the world repeats in multiple subtle ways that you are no longer quite as relevant, that your time has passed, that what you offer holds less value than it once did, it becomes very hard not to start believing it. The psychologist Ellen Langer of Harvard University conducted a study that became a classic in the field of aging psychology. She showed that when older people are treated with the expectation that they are capable of more, they actually are capable of more. That the way the environment looks at you is not neutral, that it has a measurable impact on health, on memory, on vitality. In other words, that ageism does not only wound emotionally, it has real physical consequences for those on the receiving end. And there is something else that complicates this picture, because this look from the world does not only come from the outside. Over time, it can begin to take root on the inside as well. You may start to hold yourself back before anyone asks you to. You may stop doing things not because you cannot, but because you assumed they were no longer for you. You may begin to shrink gradually and almost imperceptibly, following the script society seems to have written for this stage of life. Seneca put it with his usual precision: the greatest obstacle to living is expectation. And in this stage, other people's expectations about what you are capable of being, doing, and thinking can become the most effective cage there is. Not because it has visible locks, but because once you internalize it, you become your own jailer. This is perhaps the most subtle and at the same time the most profound reason why this stage is so demanding. Because it does not only ask you to face physical changes, relational losses, identity crises, and existential fears. On top of all of that, it asks you to remain true to who you know you are in an environment that sometimes seems determined to tell you that you are less. And that requires something that cannot be improvised. It requires an inner solidity, a root that no outside gaze can pull up. It requires what the Stoics called the inner citadel, that space within you that no external circumstance can invade, because it is built on the knowledge of your own worth, your own history, your own way of being in the world. That citadel can be built, it can be strengthened, and there are very concrete ways to do it, especially at this stage, because all of the reasons we have explored today, the changing body, the loneliness that arrives, the identity that is shaken, the fear of the future, the grief that accumulates, the shifting gaze of the world, all of them point toward the same place. The urgent need for an inner life strong enough to hold you when everything outside is changing. And that is what the final part of this video is about. Real, concrete tools, forged in Stoic wisdom, for moving through this stage not just with dignity, but with an inner peace that very few people ever manage to find. We have named the 6 reasons why this stage is the most demanding of adult life. We have looked at them without flinching, with the honesty they deserve. And now comes the question that truly matters. What do you do with all of that. Not in abstract terms, but concretely in the day-to-day, in the moments when the weight feels most real. The Stoics were not armchair philosophers. They were men and women who lived under extreme conditions and found practical tools to remain whole. And many of those tools are especially powerful for what this stage brings with it. The first of these pieces of advice has to do with something that sounds simple but demands daily practice, clearly distinguishing between what is within your control and what is not. This is the cornerstone of Stoic thought, and in this stage, it takes on a new dimension. The body that is changing is not entirely within your control, but how you care for it, listen to it, and treat it is. The departure of those you love is not in your hands, but how you honor their memory and what you do with the time you have left is. The way the world looks at you is not your decision, but you do decide which of those gazes you give authority over your life. Making this distinction every day, actively and deliberately, does not eliminate the pain, but it focuses your energy on the only place where it can actually produce something real. What depends on you? The second piece of advice is to build what Marcus Aurelius called, in his Meditations, an evening examination practice, not as a ritual of guilt, but as an act of awareness. At the end of each day, before sleep, ask yourself 3 simple questions. What did I do today that was worthwhile? Where did I spend energy on something I could not change? What will I choose to do differently tomorrow? This exercise, sustained over time, has a profound effect. It trains you to live with more intention, to notice what is working and what is draining you, and to close each day from a place of awareness, rather than letting it slip by without having truly lived it. The third has to do with the body, and with something the Stoics understood clearly. Movement is not a luxury, it is a discipline of the spirit. This is not about recapturing the physical condition you had at 30. It is about establishing a daily movement practice that is sustainable, enjoyable, where possible, and that has an effect that goes far beyond the muscles. Walking, swimming, stretching, practicing some form of yoga or Tai Chi, any form of movement that honors the body's current capabilities without comparing them to what they once were, has proven effects on emotional well-being, mental clarity, and sleep quality. And in this stage, those 3 factors are decisive for your capacity to face everything else. The fourth piece of advice is to practice what Epictetus called the philosophical reserve, which is nothing more than acting with clear intention while not clinging to the outcome. When you plan to do something, visit someone, begin a project, learn something new, give it all your energy and all your presence, but release the need for it to turn out exactly as you imagined. This stance is not resignation or passivity. It is the difference between someone who lives in constant tension because they need everything to go a certain way, and someone who can act fully because they have learned to let go of what they cannot control. In this stage, where so many things fall outside the reach of the will, that capacity to let go is a source of peace that no external circumstance can give or take. The fifth is to create what some of us call presence rituals, not as superficial relaxation techniques, but as deliberate moments in which you stop and inhabit the moment you are living, without projecting yourself into the future or back into the past. It can be as simple as taking 10 minutes each morning to have a coffee or tea in silence, without screens, without mental to-do lists, just feeling the warmth of the cup, the taste, the light coming through the window. It can be a walk where the only goal is to notice what you see, what you hear, what you feel underfoot. Buddhists call this mindfulness, but the Stoics had their own version too, the practice of being fully present in the moment being lived, because it is the only one that truly exists. In a stage where fear of the future and the weight of the past can take up so much space, the deliberate practice of being here is an act of resistance and self-love at the same time. The sixth piece of advice, and perhaps the one that stings the most because it runs against what culture usually tells us, is this: learn to ask. Learn to say you need help when you do, that you are tired when you are, that you cannot manage something you once could, not as a defeat, but as an act of integrity. The Stoics valued honesty above every form of appearance, and one of the costliest forms of self-deception in this stage is maintaining an image of total self-sufficiency while carrying far too much alone on the inside. Asking for help does not make you less, it makes you wiser, because someone who can recognize what they need and request it without shame has real strength, not performed strength. The seventh belongs to the heart of everything we have talked about today. Develop a new story about this stage, not the one society imposed on you, the one about decline, about what you can no longer do, about the best days being behind you, but one that is anchored in who you truly are right now. A story that includes what you have survived, what you know, what you have learned in ways no young person can yet know. Wisdom is not just a nice concept. It is something built through decades of real experience, of mistakes worked through, of losses integrated, of victories earned with effort. That is what you carry, and telling it, first to yourself, is the deepest act of self-love this stage can ask of you. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in one of the most memorable passages of his Meditations, something that serves as a perfect close to everything we have explored today. It is not the load that breaks you, but the way you carry it. This stage is heavy, very much so, but it also holds a promise that no other stage can offer: the chance to know yourself in a way that is only possible after enough years, enough losses, enough renewals have been lived. And that is the truth that few people tell you about the years between 65 and 75. They are hard, yes, but they are also the years where, if you choose to inhabit them with awareness, with honesty, and with love for yourself, you can arrive at a peace that depends on no external circumstance, a peace that is yours, absolutely. Today, we traveled through territory that many people prefer not to look at. We named the body that changes, the loneliness that arrives without warning, the identity that is shaken, the fear that settles in, the grief that accumulates, and the gaze of the world that sometimes hurts. Not to stay in the pain, but to do what the Stoics always proposed: look reality in the face, because only what is seen can be transformed. And then, in that seventh part, we found something equally real: that there are tools, there are practices, there is a way of moving through all of this that is neither resignation nor empty optimism. It is wisdom, the very kind that is built with every year lived, every loss integrated, every conscious choice to keep growing in spite of everything. This stage is not the end of anything. It is the most demanding, yes, but it can also be the most authentic, the one that returns you, if you allow it, to what you always were, beneath all the roles and all the labels. My name is Gabriel, and if this is your first time on this channel, I invite you to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you do not miss any of the upcoming videos. We keep exploring these big questions together, the ones that deserve to be answered with honesty and depth. And to find out who made it all the way to the end with genuine commitment, I want to invite you to write in the comments the phrase, I live with wisdom. And also tell me what country or place you are watching from. I would love to read your messages and hear from you, because this journey makes more sense when we walk it together. Before you go, I ask you to share this video with someone who is in this stage of life, or who knows someone who is. Sometimes, having a name for what you are feeling, or finding that someone else has already named it, is exactly what is needed to begin carrying it differently. See you in the next video.